What are some stories your parents, grand or grandparents told you about World War II? When the war was basically over, my grandpa, who was about 10 years old at the time, was given a rifle by an officer, and he and a friend were told to wait in the woods and shoot at American soldiers once they arrived. So they waited and hoped no soldiers would come, but eventually the Americans arrived in a truck and saw the two boys. The boys were shaking in fear and pointed the rifles at the truck. A soldier came out, walked towards the kids, took the rifles and slapped the boys. Then he went on to give them chewing gum, and the boys were put into the truck and were driven home. My father was 11 years old when he was captured with his parents in Singapore by the Japanese. His father had worked on the tin mines as an engineer in Burma. He was separated from his parents and spent the war in Changi prison, being starved, beaten and made to bury prisoners that died. He suffered all his life as a result of the treatment he received and the diseases he caught. At the end of the war, he was taken to Holland by the Red Cross and finally reunited with his parents in the UK, who also survived the war. When he was 17, he returned to Singapore with the Commonwealth Graves Commission to help point out where many were buried so they could be reburied in war graves. Grandfather is 97 and still kicking. Earned a Purple Heart for saving the life of his commanding officer. His army platoon moved into an Italian town that was supposed to be under Allied control. They approached a gate to gain entry to the fortified Safa zone. They were greeted with, "Hi, Joe," which I am told was a common way to greet other American soldiers. As they moved into the town, he said they realized there was a major problem. About the time that began to sink in, they began to be fired upon like fish in a barrel. His commanding officer was shot. My grandpa threw him over his shoulder and ran. He could hear the bullets hitting all around him. He sprinted towards a dam of some sort, as he tells it. Right as he reaches the ledge, he gets shot in the leg. Falls over the ledge, but they are carried to safety by the water. Everyone else from his platoon died there in what was essentially a massacre. That's the short version of it. I love my grandpa. My grandpa told me that when he was like 10 years old, he went with his brother to pick some old potatoes that were left on the field. All of a sudden there was a plane that tried to shoot them. Happily they were able to hide, but he said he never had so much fear in his life again. My great-grandfather bombed a sperm whale thinking it was German U-boat. The ultimate Axis weapon, Nazi whales. After the Netherlands were liberated, my grandfather's 8-year-old brother walked into the living room of his house with chocolate and cigarettes. My great-grandmother asked how he get those good. He replied, "I showed the Canadians where the hoes are." My grandpa spent his time in World War II stealing olives. He wasn't very old and growing up poor in fascist Italy. He actually would steal a donkey with his friends to carry the stolen olives, then would drop the donkey back off. Lol. I actually went to see my granddad yesterday, who's just opted out of chemo for a recent cancer diagnosis and only has a few months left. He was a 12-year-old during the Battle of Britain and was hop-picking in Kent for most of it. For the first time in my memory, he seemed keen to offload story after story. What's interesting is that, apart from the fear of bombs or doodlebugs V1s, it was mainly a grand adventure for him and his friends. He said that whenever a plane came down, kids would ride for miles to get to a crash site. Silk from parachutes was pretty valuable and could be sold bartered to make into underwear, and they used to make rings for the girls out of cockpit glass, I think. I didn't interrupt to clarify that part. If an American plane went down, there was a particular race to get to any of the surviving crew because they were renowned for giving the kids lots of really cool sweets and chocolate. Standard practice in school was to hide under your desk. If a doodlebug was spotted coming over, there was always somebody on lookout on the school roof. My grandmother pitched in here with the time a doodlebug came down in the field outside her family farm. She was younger than my granddad, so was a little girl at the time. When everybody heard the engine conk out, you had to run for the Morrison shelter in the house. For the first time ever, she found the front door locked and couldn't get into the house. The force of the explosion picked her up and threw her against the side of the house. But she survived, obviously, because I exist. The crater is still there to this day. Whenever aerial combat took place overhead, everybody would run for the ditches around the hop fields in case of stray machine gun rounds. Apart from one particular hop-picking family who would just carry on regardless. Although rare, he remembers one woman getting hit by a stray machine gun round from above and killed. German planes would often drop any leftover bombs and empty their rounds into farms and fields on their way home. Seems pretty savage. One time, one of these planes came down near a hop field, and unfortunately for one of the surviving German crew, one of the hop pickers was an ex-professional wrestler who went by the name of the Iron Duke. He promptly gave him a pounding and sat on him until some troops arrived. My grandfather was around 10 years old by the end of the war and living in rural northern Germany. He was, as almost everyone at the time, part of the Hitler Youth, and their commander gathered them all up and armed them with rifles and some Panzerfausts. Shortly before leaving for Hamburg, a high-ranking Wehrmacht officer approached the group and asked the Hitler Youth leader what the hell they were doing there. The group leader apparently answered that he wanted to free Hamburg with his group. The officer just took the man outside of sight of the boys, shot him, then went back to the boys and told them to get the hell away from there. My grandfather stumbled upon an enemy soldier in a forest. The enemy wasn't far away and they both noticed each other at the same time. The enemy got a shot of and hit my grandfather in the chest where his heart is. My grandfather shot back and killed the enemy. My grandfather survived that encounter because he carried his wallet inside his chest pocket. The wallet stopped the bullet and is the only reason that bullet didn't kill him. My grandfather kept that wallet with the bullet lodged inside and gave it to my sister a few years before he died. At some point unfortunately the bullet was lost, but the wallet with the hole left behind by the bullet still remains in my family. German here. One grandpa was bombed in his cellar with his mom. 3 days no food and water, then they were rescued from firefighters. My grandma had to flee when the Russians came and everyone was trying to get across the river on a boat. She got separated from her mom and stood there hours until her mom came back to pick her up. Other grandpa always told me that he enjoyed listening to the sound of bombs because that meant you were still alive. They all hate potatoes and pumpkin. That's all that was served yours. Mr. Grandfather Australian was stationed on Goodenough Island in Papua. He was there after the major battle and served with the ground crew on a makeshift airfield. The airfield stationed RAF and USAF aircraft, and his job, as he told it, was to gauge the fuel usage and determine how long planes were gone before they were considered lost. Long after he passed, I looked through his deployment record out of interest. He applied to become an aviator a few times but was knocked back for being too simple. My grandpa and army mates stole a tram in Melbourne while on leave and drove it up and down the line. I don't think they got in much trouble. My grandma and granddad were forcibly removed from their parents and made to work for the Germans. Grandma was a milkmaid in Dresden and she cried every night because her mum always used to braid her hair, but grandma didn't know how to do it herself. Opa was in Holland at the time and was loaded onto a bus taking them to a camp. Opa, being the stubborn Dutchman that runs through my family to this day, saw his opportunity to escape and he did. The bus had to pull over and stop for some reason. I do not know the reason, but he was lucky. They were next to a cornfield. Opa saw the chance and ran off that damn bus and never looked back. Ran until he couldn't anymore. Got home, packed his bags and moved to Canada right after the war. My great granddad fought in the British Army somewhere in the West. He was taken as a POW by the Germans and sent to a camp in Poland for the remainder of the war. From what I've heard, he made a Polish or Russian friend somewhere along the way, and that friend was eventually executed. Not exactly sure of the details. I'd have to ask my gran. But by all accounts he didn't like talking about the war. I'm thankful to have got to meet him when I was young before he died at the age of 92. He was a great man and is remembered fondly. My great-grandfather, Jesse James Clymer, was in the Navy and left my great-grandmother behind with their daughter and another on the way. Stationed at Pearl Harbor, he wrote letters to her, telling her about how beautiful Hawaii was, and that he wanted to show her the island when the war was over. The day after receiving the letter, the Japanese bombed the US naval base, and he found himself in the hospital days later. His lips and chin had been near blasted off from the explosion. My great-grandmother heard of the bombing and thought she'd never see her husband again, but a month or so later he'd been shipped back home with a Purple Heart pinned to his shirt. And the biggest smile on his face. He got to come home, son some face flesh, and meet his newborn son. The story about how my great-grandparents got together, very romantic. He was a RAF flight instructor and she was a mechanic for airplanes. He landed on her jacket by mistake and she yelled at him. He fell in love with her and stayed in love until he died at 65. She loved him until she passed at 87. Hollywood should make a movie about it.